Season 4, Episode 4. Hey everyone, we're back with another episode of the Actual Fluency Podcast, and today I've got a special guest. Recently I've been asking you guys out there if you have any interesting language learning stories or things about your identity or culture, anything you wanted to talk about in the podcast, to just send me a little message on actualfluency.com/guest. And one of the people who reached out was Marcus from Tazmania, who was really interested in the cultural implications of language learning, including identity formation. So we're going to talk a little bit about that and much more. And Marcus, welcome to the show. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you very much, Chris. I really appreciate you having me.
All right.
I'd also like to say thank you for producing the podcast. It's been wonderful to follow along your journey as a language learner, and also to hear so many of the wonderful insights from various language learners and the greats out there also in terms of their advice. So
thank you so much.
It's been wonderful to be a part of the community.
Thank you so much. And actually, one of the things that you wrote in the little message that you attached was the polyglot journey, which I really appreciate. I often talk about this, and why don't we start the discussion today with your polyglot journey? How did you get into the wonderful world of language learning and cultural?
Well, in many ways, my association developed through listening to the podcast. I'm a latecomer in many ways to language learning. I began my educational foray into languages and the like by studying Latin and Ancient Greek at university. That was actually only within the last 4 years. I recently completed an honours thesis looking at ancient Greek poetry, particularly ancient Greek drama and ancient Greek comedy. So I had a very different understanding of language learning, of something of it being a bookish endeavor, perhaps, of something quite removed from community. And through being associated with so many of the wonderful, polyglots that are putting their materials out there, like yourself and like so many of the greats, whether it be through blog format, podcast format, YouTube videos, of course, that really prompted me to consider learning a language that I might actually get out and speak with people. So in many ways, I started out floundering, just taking on basic recommendations about the typical ways to learn a language. Let's say Duolingo, let's say teach yourself, all those sort of basic ways of starting out, getting an understanding of the language. I struggled in many ways to fit that mold because I had previously learnt from essentially what is a grammar translation method with Latin and Ancient Greek, simply reading text, back translating into English at all times, relying heavily upon adapted texts and, doing grammar drills and the like before that. It's something I enjoyed, and I loved the opportunity it gave me to learn more about structures within the English language. But in many ways, there was still something lacking. There was still obviously an inability to speak those languages. And whilst I had the opportunities to explore so many rich aspects of the cultural history associated with those languages, it still didn't provide what living people within my own community could do. So in many ways, on your recommendation, I discovered the Michelle Thomas course. And as my partner is German, I decided to order in the German Michelle Thomas course. However, through the local library, it had quite a wait time on it. And in that time, the Arabic course arrived first, and I decided to investigate it to see how the structure of the Michel Thomas course worked, and I was hooked. I went through the entire program. I went through the foundation, the advanced, the vocabulary course, and that really spurred my interest to get out there and speak to people within my community, many of who had been stigmatized in many ways as foreigners, as immigrant workers and the like. So I felt like I really wanted to challenge those misconceptions by finding out more about their story, and particularly by using the language. Um, so in many ways that I've been traveling along to a point now where Arabic has become a language that I have consolidated. Mostly I've needed to go back from the Michel Thomas method and look at reading and writing, as well as just listening and speaking, and incorporating more textbook grammar focus, now moving into a period of reading literature and the like. Um, it always comes up in discussion, where would you place yourself at this stage now? I believe I'd place myself at a B1, fluctuating in and out of a B2. I'm sure you would understand yourself with the level that
For
you've
sure.
achieved with Russian. You're always negotiating new cultural elements within the language. Once you get beyond the sort of B1 stage, you will learn something, go out and use it, and be told, "Look, we don't say it that way," and
Yeah.
and the like. So
Yeah.
but that's also created some wonderful friendships where I've been able to go back and forth with the language, and develop that closeness through the language, and that encouragement that has really helped me to stick with the language. And since then, it's given me greater confidence to add languages independently now. So I've also undertaken Persian, or Farsi, to and what I would suggest is an A2 level now, which has had more of an emphasis on conversation within the community, and also now beginning German, with the emphasis of wanting to speak with my partner, and however I've been now focusing more so on reading and writing in order to kind of balance out that headspace of managing languages at a different level, at a bit of a higher level now with Arabic, and now Farsi quite conversational, but German really just starting out, but about really challenging that final barrier of learning my partner's language, which has been so important to me for some time.
Right. The first mission is finally coming around.
Yes.
So you're using the Michel Thomas method for German again, or have you
I'm
developed
actually I'm
your?
actually not. Yeah, so I'm actually studying that at university now, and there
Oh,
has been more of a traditional focus on the language, similar to how I had studied Latin and ancient Greek. I'm going with the grammar drills, a lot of free writing, particularly a lot of exercises, with a little less emphasis on speaking at the moment.
well, that's fair enough. I think that it's easier to go the other way around sometimes when you have a really good overall picture of how the language works, grammar wise and writing wise. You can get back into the speaking, but as someone who's never really learned to write German very well, it's really tough to learn how to write after having learned how to speak, at least write well. So I think it's a fine approach. It's definitely usable for vocabulary and grammar, which German is, of course, has lots of grammar to digest. So
Absolutely. And I find that really fascinating, having studied Latin and ancient Greek, because I'm getting to see where so many of the roots are quite different from the English language
right,
as well. And that's it's spurring on my curiosity to do the work each day and the like as well.
Fantastic. Just when you something I really wanted to pick up on when you started the Arabic mission, if you want to use that term, you said that after you listened to all the Michel Thomas, you had this desire to go out and use the language with people. How did that go? And did you feel any sort of limitations, any huge wins, or what happened when you tried to go out and use it after such a short time?
Really, the community here is very small in terms of the Arabic speaking community, but they have been so encouraging and so accepting. One thing that really rang true with me was your interview with Arina Pravat, who mentioned it's important to use a little bit of the language as you're learning. And that's in many ways what I did. Sometimes hearing a little bit of Arabic and using what I could to initiate conversation meant that we could then switch to English and hear a little bit more about each other's stories and about our motivations for our our lives here in Tasmania, Australia, our employment, our families, and our cultural associations and the like. So everyone was always very supportive. There were certainly times where I had gotten a little in over my head in terms of understanding what was coming back at me. Um, there's also the difficulty with having learned one dialect of Arabic in Egyptian dialect. I had to navigate that realm also with more formal dialects and the like represented within the community here, particularly Saudi Arabian dialects of the Khaliji strand and the like. So yeah, uh, it's been progressive at all points, and those relationships have been developing, but they've been very fulfilling at all times. And I've never gone away from a situation and felt like I couldn't feel confident about the next time and wanting to speak more with those people and incorporate and that really helped shape what I wanted to learn next, having moved away from coursework material, wanting to create, I guess, uh, descriptors that were relevant to my my current circumstances and my motivations and the like, which would only then uh, spur on that inspiration.
Exactly, and motivation and inspiration, I guess, is a byproduct of the relationship you get with the language, or indeed the speakers of the language. And if people are very dismissive of the idea that foreigners are learning the language, like you've sometimes heard about in Scandinavia, for instance, where there's almost like a well, why would you do that kind of attitude? It's tough to feel super inspired and motivated if they all speak great English and they don't really care if you speak Danish or Swedish or whatever. Um,
Absolutely. And that's meant a lot to me in terms of following those views also, because in many ways I have been resisting against those attitudes for so long myself here in monolingual Australia.
right. And so what's yeah? Maybe you can share a little bit more about that because certainly for me, I've never been even close to Australia, and before the recording, we talked about that you're probably the furthest guest from me that I could have. So maybe you can share a little bit about the kind of the attitude towards foreign languages in Australia and Tasmania and New Zealand because we know about America, we know about England. I think to a large extent we often hear about that, but how is it actually in down south, as they say?
Absolutely. I mean, sadly, I myself missed out on any opportunities to study a language in school. Generally, those sorts of opportunities are made less available to people living in regionalized areas. It's been very dependent upon having both financial backing and the resources in the form of native speakers and the like. Of course, this is pre-internet age when I studied in school myself, and so again, it relied upon the resources of the local community. Um, More generally, there has been attitudes directed towards in many ways, a real lack of um, positive development in language learning more generally, and also and cultural learning also. It's Australia has been one of those countries where generally people are expected to assimilate.
Right.
And I myself had come from a background with a Hungarian father and an Irish mother, um, and had had associations with many other people growing up who had come from migrant and immigrant backgrounds, but whose parents did not continue their home language with them. They had an idea that in Australia we speak English, and therefore um, there were also varying attitudes towards the effect that would have on children developing, 20, 30 years ago and the like. And now, in many ways, we're seeing the ramifications of those decisions, where there are people like myself who are struggling to develop a sense of their own identity as displaced peoples, having a yearning to understand something about their cultural heritage, whether that be European or British or something, wider construct perhaps as well. And so it's been a difficult process for myself in terms of coming to define what was important to me in relation to my identity because of those limitations on cultural and language learning opportunities in Australia.
That's pretty that's pretty bad, I guess, when you can't even when you don't even get the choice or the offer in the first place. Then it's, I mean,
It is. I mean, for myself, it took going through my undergraduate to realize that languages was something that I was interested in.
that's pretty late when you consider that in Europe you're certainly in Scandinavia you start English, when you're 8, 10 years old, and by then you've already watched 20 seasons of Friends or whatever series is going on the TV every day. So you've got uh, there's lots of immersion already happening without you realizing it. It's
Absolutely.
kind
Attitudes certainly are shifting here, and particularly in a regionalized area like Tasmania, I'm being informed more about um, the integration of technology and the like, and moving away from those regionalized areas being disadvantaged. The other situation with language learning in Australia, particularly, is that it doesn't necessarily follow the same viewpoint as the European schools do, which is that certain languages are ranked in difficulty. Generally, in Australia, languages are regarded due to their locality status and their minority status and the association within communities. So in many ways, our the languages that are best represented in schooling systems here in Tasmania are what European schools would consider to be the hardest languages. They are to Mandarin Chinese due to our proximity, obviously, to China, and Arabic being another big one due to immigration here in Australia, as well as Greek and Italian and many of the languages that were brought here during the influx of the migrations after World War II.
cool. Cool. In your little bio, you also wrote that you're a cultural enthusiast. Can you just
Yes,
give a little explanation as to what that means and
I feel like in many ways what started my journey as a polyglot was your first episode, Chris, which
wow.
was with David Mansoret, and he described himself as a polymath.
Right.
somebody who loved to learn as much as he could, a lover of learning, so to speak. And I find that I identified so greatly with that perspective. Um, I had worked for a number of years in order to support myself. I did an apprenticeship here in Australia before later on deciding that I would go to university to somewhat rediscover what it is I wanted to do with my life. And in many ways, I really struggled with the concept of university level education. I struggled to navigate the realm of academia. I felt like I wasn't cut out for it. And it was actually within the ancient history program at one of the universities here that first enabled me to feel like I can get through these hurdles. I had a wonderful lecturer who was very supportive of my writing, who was a very much one of an important mentor in my life at that stage, and the enthusiasm and the passion that he had for the Latin language and for the ancient world and for the I mean, he just breathed life into the ancient world. So I became captivated by the ancient Romans and the ancient Greeks, and to me, it represented an opportunity to learn, in many ways, what I saw to be an elite, uh, learn within an elite sphere that I something I would have been denied throughout my earliest attempt at schooling, having gone to school in a regionalized area, having missed out on language learning and the like. And so, um, yeah, that really helped. In many ways, my original focus was on archaeology, was on classics and ancient literature. And from there, I finally made the plunge to study the languages themselves and learn more about the roots and the history of the English language, and therefore make comparisons with other languages developed from Latin in the Romance sphere and the like. And that, yeah, just really helped me to define what it is that was important to me, how I wanted to identify myself to others. And in many ways, it's exactly as David described in that first episode, a a lover of learning, somebody who's yearning to learn, but also in many ways he encouraged me to realize that what you are is always changing. Um, you can't really define yourself based on a set of experiences, whether it be in school or in your teenage years. So it helped me to say, well, I can redefine myself as an educated person, and I can have success learning independently in other spheres, whether it be within science, within literature, within philosophy. And now I can transfer that and have success in something else as an independent learner, learning about languages, but of course, learning about the history and the culture that goes hand in hand with those languages and with the people that I now engage with. And I find it so important to it's so important to take the opportunity to orient yourself towards whatever it is that you feel you could be passionate about. So for me, I remember when I first started Latin, I read A Natural History of Latin. And when I started studying archaeology, I read magazine articles on archaeology. And now, having studied informally so many aspects of language learning, I've now come to a point where I'm uh, deciding now I've undertaking a master's of applied linguistics, so really formalizing that training now and hoping to also, like yourself, get out there and promote the value of language learning and to assist others in their goals also. But that came out of a very informal association that started, in many ways with following your journey as let's say as an average language learner, which really did inspire me to just get started and think about where I wanted to go.
That's super cool, man. I appreciate that. It's super cool to hear that that this podcast is not only for fun and jokes all the time. That people are actually listening to the stuff that we babble on about sometimes and actually take it to heart. Because I fundamentally believe that we're capable of doing anything. Like some guys, 40, 50 years ago, had the idea that we could send a ship to the moon, and that seemed like crazy at the time, but obviously it was possible. So that guy became a genius, and I feel like we can apply that thinking to just about anything. People might think, oh, it's really hard to study neuroscience. Well, if you're interested in how the brain works, there's a neuroscience for dummies. It's on my Kindle.
Absolutely.
You can start, slowly, but it's really hard to learn something if you resist it mentally and say, like, if we bring it back to languages, for instance, if we say, "Oh, I'm not a language learner. I can't learn German and speak to my wife or, a friend from Düsseldorf or whatever," um, the belief that you can't do something is really, really rock solid.
Absolutely. I agree with you 100%. And it's really it's sad in many ways that people don't take their success from learning in other spheres and apply it to language learning, because had I not been able to do that, I think that I would still be struggling against those things as well. It's because, and yet, we see people who go out and they start they start a degree in nursing in their mid 30s, and they succeed, and they're teaching themselves things that they've never had an association with, yet they're still going to tell themselves that they can't learn languages because of the experiences they had in school.
Or just pressure from the outside or myths. Just it's not possible to learn language when you're an adult. I mean, that is the
Yeah.
one I hear a lot from people. And in fact, when I talk to people in general and I sort of explain what I'm doing, they say, "Oh, but I don't have a talent for language learning. Oh, I didn't learn as a child, so now I can't learn." And I guess the fundamental problem is really that our brain is telling us things that aren't true, because we can learn anything we want. And I'm really happy that you discovered that, and I guess at a very opportune time during academic struggle, and the idea that you can turn and, well, not negatives necessarily, but you can turn hardship into strengths as well. Like a good example I got from Arena recently is she said, "I used to really hate doing the dishes." And as someone who hates doing the dishes with a passion, I was, my ears perked up, and I was like, okay, go on. She said that instead of seeing it as something, a chore and something that has to be done, and just a negative experience overall, she reframed it and made it into basically sort of a meditative state where she takes a break from whatever she's doing, and she just stands there for 15, 20 minutes, whatever, how long it takes, and maybe even put some kind of audio content on a podcast, or you don't even have to. You can also just put some chants on, like some background music, and just take a breather and try to focus on finding yourself. And she said after she did that, doing the dishes was the best time of her day. And I was like, that's a really interesting example.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think it is about taking the aspects of a setting that really makes something enjoyable for you. And I think, that's been key in many ways with uh, with, I think, myself, a lot of other people's language learning journeys in the world as well. You can talk about, learning as a chore, or you can actually start to structure what you're doing based on your interests and what is exciting to you, and therefore it is no longer a chore. It doesn't necessarily. I always make a point for myself to simply discover something new about my target languages, and sometimes that's simply picking up a book. It may even be an English translation of a famous work or the like, but just trying to understand some aspect of it. And generally that will lead into, a half an hour, 45-minute study session anyway. But it's about sparking that interest and saying, like, I'm curious about this concept or this idea or this word. I'll look it up, and then all of a sudden you're writing out notes and practicing these phrases and the like. But then of course you get out there and you incorporate that little bit of learning. For myself, it might be like a small line of Hafez's poetry in Farsi as I'm getting out in the community. And then I get to hear so much more about somebody's own association with that piece or the like. And I think I'm so proud that I spent the time learning those two lines to then go out and utilize to then get that story, to get that inspiration to go further, because that's not studying a language, that's not work. Then it's about learning, yes, um but in a very uplifting way.
And you've got the end goal in mind as well, or at least one of the end goals, and that is to use it to speak to someone or use it to speak about. And
A-
that's something that
Absolutely.
sometimes also fails because when we have this sort of polyglot community where everyone is excited about learning languages, sometimes you forget that it's actually a tool. It's not the end goal to know German or have 2,000 words in your vocabulary. It's actually to use it to something. Could be reading, could be writing,
Absolutely.
could be talking to people. But
It
it sounds
certainly
like you
is the
found that very
case.
natural, having that end goal for your languages.
It certainly is the case. I think that's where the idea of being a cultural enthusiast comes across, but it's also very different because of my environment here in a regionalized area where I am not having the opportunity to go to a polyglot pub or a polyglot club and the like and use those introductory phrases and hi, how are you going, nice to see you here, haven't seen you in a long time. um, I'm having to then build more lasting relationships with people here, and it's difficult. You do get emotionally invested in their stories, and sometimes that can be even more troubling with a language barrier because you want to express the utmost empathy for the situation, perhaps when dealing with somebody like a refugee who has the opportunity to use a little bit of the language to gain an association, but then is also now using their second language in English to explain to you a particular aspect of what they may have went through. It is very difficult to not want to then have the vocabulary and the understanding to express the hurt that you identify with them. And I think that's why it's been so important for me to hang on to those moments and to go away, use that as inspiration to learn more, and then to come back and continue to build those friendships and those relationships within the community. It's also helped me identify in myself what's particularly important about my own identity, what I would call identity realization, much rather than formation,
Right.
because it has allowed me to emphasize certain aspects. Growing up in Australia, um, it is very common for people to have migrant and immigrant heritage, but as I also suggested, it's also very common for that to be pushed to the side when you're being socialized growing up and the like. So it was very interesting to me that when I started to engage with refugee communities here, it was actually very important for me to learn the vocabulary to talk about who my father was as a Hungarian person who came here and supplanted his home language with English and who integrated, and how it's also equally important now raising my son for him to have the opportunity to embrace his cultural heritage in a newly developing society here in Australia, and one that welcomes people such as refugees also. So yeah, it was very interesting to me to think, well, my Hungarian heritage was of little relevance if I were to speak with a group of high school friends and the like. But in this context, it was actually deeply connected to who I wanted to portray myself as when dealing with these people. So,
That's interesting. Why do you think that came up?
um, I think it was my only means of empathizing with their position in many ways,
Hmm.
and I think that's why I chose to. But I say that now, but they also helped me to realize that it was important to me, and it was important to realizing my own identity within myself, despite the fact that that has created barriers. Also, I often kick myself as how I can go out and learn Arabic to this level, to a B1, to a B2 level, to utilize Farsi conversationally, but to not successfully learn my home language or and
Right.
the like in Hungarian. So
Yeah, well, I mean, as someone who's learning Hungarian, you definitely have a big, let's say, present of enjoyment there if you're into the grammar and technically difficult languages. So that may be a later challenge.
thank you. No, it certainly will be on my list.
Great. I mean, I guess what I hear is sort of when you explain that you meet these refugees, I guess what you think is, in a way, I guess suppose, especially in Australia, as you say, where many people have immigrant heritage. In a way, we're all immigrants in somewhere somehow. I mean, it's very few people who are completely pure blood, dating back to the aristocrats of that country or whatever. I guess
Absolutely.
Australia
And
isn't even that
in
old.
well, in our case, it's even sadder because, to learn one of the indigenous languages, you're very limited, of course, with so many of them having been displaced, even obliterated, with European occupation. So it's a very sad circumstance in that respect.
Yeah, so you want to completely, connect on an emotional level as well, and identity is a tough one, I would say. And how do you? I'd like to hear some of your thoughts on identity more broadly, because as we talked about in a few episodes ago with Arena, we talked about how tough it is to, or how tough it can be to find your own identity when you're so interested in so many cultures, and maybe you have a very diverse background, and maybe you live in a foreign environment, or you've emigrated from home, and suddenly you're finding yourself questioning your very fundamentals. And as someone who's done that in their home country, what are your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. I think in many ways it's important to be mindful that your own understanding of your identity is, as David Mansoret suggested early on, it is really flexible and it is ever evolving. And so I have always tried to be very mindful of what opportunities have come up, even now, with having a desire and an interest in languages that are even so thoroughly removed from how I could perhaps most naturally identify. Obviously being an Australian and not somebody from an Arabic speaking background initially and the like, but having such a close affinity with the language now, and with the cultural elements, and even with morality and with worldview, it's very important to. It sounds cliche, but to just go with it, to really think, okay, there are natural forces that are encouraging me to explore certain aspects of my, whether it be cultural heritage or whether it be associations with other cultures, with languages, with parts of the world. I mean, I myself, my heart, I have felt for the longest time, is floating on the Danube. So, so that is important for me to explore that, even if it's just to pick up a coffee table book and look at pictures of Budapest and to see, you know, what I long to see with my own eyes. I think it's important to really go with that, and that's why my study sessions have developed so much out of just a curiosity of one particular aspect, or wanting to say one thing, or the like. When it comes to identity, I think it doesn't need to be such a conscious process. I think identity formation has never really fit with my understanding. I've always gone with the idea of identity realization, and that there are many aspects and many opportunities to realize what defines your identity. Had I not had the opportunity to go through my university studies, I wouldn't have realized that I had the capacity to be an educated person,
Right.
and to set an example for my son, and to have success learning in a sphere academically, that could then transfer not only to learning independently, but helping others learn now as I go on to study to be a teacher, and the like, and of course as I impart my wisdom onto my son also. um, and so, yeah, I think in many ways I wasn't defining myself as the sort of person that I wanted to be. And now I've been able to be a little more mindful of each influence in my life, whether it be meeting a person, or whether it be reading a book, or whether it be coming across an article, or even whether it be having a particular thought. It's helped me now to think about how that can influence um, my understanding of who I would like to be.
Hmm.
Um, and so it is difficult, because then it does sound like a conscious thing. I think we in the language learning community, I think identity formation is really tied to that exploration of another culture, or another language. I don't think it needs to be so constrained. Um, I think, for instance, I think you could still be studying within a thoroughly Western discourse, and yet have associations with Confucianism, and perhaps and moralizing worldviews associated with the East. I don't think that you need to thoroughly invest yourself in Asian culture to explore that. Just like similarly, people who are coming from foreign language learning backgrounds to learn English for professional purposes, or to advance their careers, doesn't necessarily mean that they can't discover aspects of the the culture associated with their learning surrounds that fit with their own ideals initially. It's not. I think the idea of teaching cultural elements within language learning has been really uh, over strategized in terms of trying. I mean, and particularly when you're dealing with a language like English, which in fact has many cultures associated
Mm-hmm.
with it, and there is no one defining culture. I think it is very difficult to, because then it's also hard for people to discover what's important for them. I think the other thing is important when it comes to identities and language learning is that um, they're very much they're very much characterized by imagined identities and imagined communities that people are struggling to navigate into throughout the learning process. And I find, for instance, an example can be people learning English for professional purposes. They may have had a professional career in their own country and they want to be immediately accepted into that new realm of academia in the English language. But of course, there is that hurdle of overcoming the language barrier, but also that, let's say, cultural barrier, but that's not necessarily defined by nationality or the like. That's defined by socialization practices within Western discourse, within business discourse, and professional discourse, and the like. And I think it's also important to realize that people have varying levels of investment in that as well. So it's not
Sure.
solely about motivation, but about their that pull of that heartstring in many ways.
Sure. So also, just to sum up that, it seems like you say that identity is very moldable, is very flexible, and it's a snapshot of our current position, mentally, psychologically, physically, I guess also, and that we shouldn't be try to commit to be one thing at any given time. Always be open for new ideas, and the last part, I guess, is that it's pretty random at times. Like the reason we're talking now is because of a long series of coincidences leading back to years back when you were doing the university degree, and I was well, I don't even remember how I got started on the path. I guess that was all the way back in primary school when I was really fascinated by German. Of course, throughout the way I got sidetracked and I lost that. I forgot that passion and that interest, but I really appreciate where I am. I really appreciate kind of I guess the blessed destiny in a way. I don't really believe in destiny or fate or anything like that, but I think that where we are is largely a coincidence, and I just appreciate it. I just appreciate that I get the chance to talk to you today, for instance.
Absolutely, and as do I, because part of that realization process for me was very much tied to the confidence that grew within yourself and the discussions that you had, particularly on your solo podcasts, about your struggles and the like. So that really did help me, because they're those sorts of things that give you indirect advice. They give you the opportunity to reflect upon your own position in the world, and how you want, as I say, that they're the things that make you think about how you want to define yourself. And a big one for me was very much tied to your experience. Was part of redefining myself or realizing who I wanted to be was, do I want to be unhappy? Do I want to be depressed?
Mm-hmm.
And the like. And so, um, yeah, I, I just want to say ultimately that I know many other listeners are very proud of where you've come to.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. And I guess one final thing that I did see before we move on to relationships, which I always also wanted to talk to you about today,
Yep.
is sometimes I think identity gets tied into values a little bit. So it seems
Yep.
like, whereas I think values are fixed. I mean, you have your ultimate values deep down. If you want to change your values, that to me is quite a serious and long term. I
It
mean,
takes conscious effort.
yeah, that's an
Absolutely.
exposure to a series of mental changes. I would say for values to change because they're just so ingrained in who we are. But I think the identity is only a part of that. So I don't think that necessarily just because you start, I don't know, just because if you find something culturally interesting in something, that doesn't mean that your core values are changing. It just means that your identity is developing. And for me, it doesn't. We'll never lose track on the values, which, by the way, I think is also really cool to reflect on. What are my values? What do I value the most in life, and what are my core values also? And there's a lot written on
Mm.
this subject, of course. Um, Whereas I think the identity for me is a very sort of fleeting snapshot, like you mentioned before. Like David also said that, well, if you want to be, for instance, I just took up chess, trying to become better at chess. That wasn't part of my identity before, but
Yeah.
now I do kind of consider it part of my identity. You know, kind of a, I guess I would call it a an intellectual pursuit outside of learning. Well, it's actually learning as well, but it's definitely an intellectual pursuit for me.
Absolutely. And the important thing to do within the realization process of identity is to grasp those opportunities and simply reflect upon them. It's about enjoying what seemingly feels right at the time and then taking time later to reflect upon it, but also not at the same time, and this may sound counterintuitive, to not overthink it um, and therefore think about why it is that that has suddenly started to shape or to mold a new identity for myself. It's really just about saying like these coincidental circumstances keep cropping up and they're important to me and I need to continue to embrace it, and whether that be and I mean, look, I know the people that have this difficulty the most are people who want to study 8, 9, 10 languages at one time
Right.
because they're wanting to explore various aspects of those languages. And I think that there are ways to do that intelligently with that because again, the investment is different. The motivation can it can be the same, but the investment in those languages may be different. And for for some people, it may just be enjoyable to use that small amount to give that confidence in a social encounter and the like. And I really believe that's a great thing to be doing also, to just go, okay, like I have all these wild interests and I want to explore as many of them as possible because that does help you simply realize opportunity. And like you say, you never know where it will lead you. You never know that in 2 years it might lead to meeting perhaps the mother of your child or the father of your child, or an opportunity to travel, to take on new work
Yeah.
opportunities. So it really is just about seizing what means something to you now.
Right, and there's nothing better for me to look back and see that happen. And for instance, 2 years ago, I don't think I could imagine having gone to New York, to just casually going to New York to a language conference. You know, if you told me back then, I would have questioned that very dearly because, first of all, financially, it's really expensive to go to New York, to America in general. And secondly, language conference, like, why? So
Absolutely.
I find that great. And I use that with my languages also. If I feel like I'm a little bit down on myself for my language ability, which is quite often, to be honest, I will sometimes say, well, how much Russian did I know 2 years ago? And I think back and I was like, I think I knew how to say da pretty much. and then I just realized, well, I can watch Russian TV shows now, and yeah, I don't understand everything, and I can't have like super deep conversations yet, but the realization that you've come really far sometimes is a great counter to the thoughts that, oh, I have really far to go. Because that's
Certainly.
kind of the natural reaction when you talk about learning a language is, oh, I need to climb this Mount Fluency or whatever. And in reality, you've already done so much work, but because of cognitive biases, I guess, we just don't realize it. I mean, it's really hard to know how much you actually do know unless you're being quizzed on it. And I mean, why would you do that? So for me,
And
that's a
that's
good.
about having a different motivation for the learning, and it's about realizing what's really important in terms of, I think you've defined yourself over this period more as somebody who is simply invested in the learning process and in experiencing what it is to make those gains with the language, and of course to build those relationships with the people that you've been meeting within the community and the like, as I felt I've been able to do through a channel such as your podcast.
Yeah, exactly. And that's you hit the nail on the head there. It's definitely true. And speaking of relationships, the importance of building lasting relationships. I don't think many people doubt the importance. But what is it that foreign languages, or especially learning foreign languages, can do for this fascinating aspect of human nature?
Well, I think in one aspect, there's obviously the language learning community. So, in many ways, I feel like I've developed my own association with yourself and with many of with the guests that you've featured as well. Gaining the confidence and the understanding and the wisdom from many of those minds, and listening to them each week, placing myself in a particular experience or difficulty in my life at that time, and feeling inspired or the like, has really helped to feel as though I've built lasting relationships um, in a community that's been very supportive behind the scenes of my own progression and advancement. So that's first and foremost. But as I say, I've also been very fortunate to utilize my language with community members who I'm able to identify and get out and see every now and again, whether it be my son playing at the park and running into other parents, hearing a little bit of the language and questioning where people are from, and the like. So I have been very fortunate living in a regionalized area that I can do that. And I'm also very fortunate that we do have some small level traffic coming through here with university programs and the like from various parts of the world. Um, I made it a real point to learn a little bit of the languages that were represented in my community, simply to say hello and perhaps welcome
Mm-hmm.
here in Australia, and that was often met with utmost enthusiasm from those initial forays into the language. And of course, I made many efforts there for that to flourish into friendships and the like. So I remember myself when I first met the first Persian speaking refugees here in my community. Uh, I said to them, "Hello, salam," and they offered me some fruit, and I made a real point to learn to learn a very very simple phrase to say that this fruit is a gift. And so I went back to the park with my son every day for 8 days until I was picking apricots from our tree each day, and of course each day they had to come home and be utilized in some way. Luckily, our son was quite young, and he was just devouring fruit. So yeah, each day I would pick this little bit in the hopes of being able to offer them something in return, and say to them, my little phrase, "Mi verba fama," and and it allowed them to develop a trusting relationship, which then gave me the opportunity to hear their
That's great.
stories. Um, yeah, and I
Did it
mean,
succeed?
it did. In the end, eighth day, I was able to give them some fruit from our fruit tree, and to use a little more of the language, to give them my name and to explain why I've learned, I'm wanting to learn their language. And from there, each time, I could come away with something I didn't quite understand that I could look up, and
Sure.
and I could learn a little bit more and from a phrase book or the like, and try to talk about the weather in a different way to engage conversation. And it's been so fulfilling to have that motivation outside of, say, practicing all of your languages, so that you can go to a polyglot meetup and as I say, use "hi, how are you," and all that, within the constraints of a few moments before that relationship dissipates. um,
Right.
and of course, with my Arabic learning, which I've now taken to an intermediate level, it's been so incredibly encouraging to get out there and explain my motivations for learning, which I think is tied to my identity now as a language learner.
What do you answer when
Um,
they ask?
um, I feel like now, I quite honestly embrace the fact that it is about exploring things that seem or feel important to me, and I'm going on that hunch of learning more, and trying to get away from the idea that because it's from another culture, it can't fit with my current identity or my
Uh huh.
Western socialization and the like. So yeah, I do explain to them the values and the certain things that fit with me throughout my learning as well. Obviously, with learning a language, you learn pieces of, you study sections of literature and the like, and you think about the concepts. And it's amazing to think about the, three or four lines that I may have worked on in a passage one evening, and how that will resonate with me the next day. For instance, I read a passage in Arabic that spoke about a person who was complaining about his poverty, and he was advised to go out and to gather firewood. And then he was able to sell that wood and provide food for his family. Now, the day after I read that, I was given an opportunity through a friend of mine to actually do some work, and that work was chopping firewood and the like, which, as students, certainly was welcomed in terms of having any opportunity. But that has also been developing into a really great relationship where I'm asking that person about their cultural heritage and what's important to them, and discovering, oh, well, actually, my father was Polish and I'd love to learn the language, but I've always told myself I couldn't. And so now I'm able to bring my expertise. This is all conducted in English, but I'm able to say, well, I've been studying, informally language learning. I'm now studying my Masters of Applied Linguistics, and I can give you a lot of great advice from this wonderful podcast that says, hey, like, you don't have to put it off. As an older person, you can still be successful in learning. Michelle Thomas has a Polish course. If you'd love to explore that aspect of your heritage, well, I can enable you in some way, and give you some confidence like others did to me. And so that's why I think it's important to just take those little elements and think about um, how they can build on the relationships that you're trying to create within the language learning community. And as I say, like, the greatest enjoyment I get is is in the struggle, is in when there's a little bit that I can't understand, or and then they can, perhaps explain it to me. Obviously, when again, being fortunate enough that many of the speakers I encounter also speak English, they can break down, aspects that I don't understand, or explain the cultural nuances of what they have just said to me and the like. And I never forget learning in those experiences. So that's another thing that's helped to build those relationships, because I have such a love of learning, for them to encourage that by teaching me even just a line in their language. And I never forget what I've learned in those experiences.
Yeah, what a wonderful world we would have if more people were like you, because you're really
Thank
doing a
you.
great job for your community. But I mean, we're not hiding the fact that it's also for you, of course. It's if not mainly for you, but you're definitely doing a great job for the community. And you remind me a little bit of Richard Benson, who was on the podcast. I guess about a dozen episodes or so ago, maybe more.
Absolutely. Yeah,
He's
he spoke out to me very much so, in terms of being somebody who's taken a very different approach to
yeah,
teaching in within a community. It's I think he's giving more than he is teaching.
he's
Um,
he's learning. You know, the funny story was he, the guy in the parking house. He was sitting there and he wasn't Somali, so he was like, "Where are you from?" Oh, I'm from. Where was he from? I forgot, but did he speak Amharic or something? And he was like, oh, "I gotta go home and learn how to say hi in Amharic now."
I
And,
have that difficulty all the time with trying to take on board advice from the podcasts, and people who say, stick with your target language, focus entirely on that. And I do very much the same thing. I meet a new person and I go, now I have to learn that language, because
yeah,
I want to have that invested relationship with those people. And look, a lot of what I began doing came out of my desire to simply help people with English, with doing informal English cafe scenarios and the like, with tutoring at a local migrant resource centre, and wanting to ease that process by simply using a bit of language, and even using it in the wrong way. That's what gave me great confidence, because if I made mistakes, it showed them that it's okay to do so in English, and it created laughter and ease that tension. And so that's another way that I've been able to really build some lasting relationships with people here, with young people who are going to go on and reshape the social identity of Australia, and reshape the opportunities that are available to people like my son, younger people growing up, who can be very proud of their cultural heritage, and who can um, be very proud to speak another language and the like, in the home, or to simply be aware that there are other languages out there, and to be a little more open-minded, as Australians have typically been regarded
well, yeah,
defunct in that regard.
but you're not alone. I mean, the what I'm thinking about is particularly in America. There's a big, very protective almost, or they think they're protective anyway. Of they're very scared of foreign cultures and languages. So when let's say there's a big Hispanic population in an American city, often you'll have a great divide where and you think it's quite crazy, right? Because I mean, you learning Arabic, that's quite an achievement. Those languages are really different and completely fundamentally different even. But for an English person to learn, let's say, 10 Spanish phrases and be forthcoming instead of saying, oh, those immigrants or whatever, that would change the world in America. Well, that would change definitely life in America as we know it, because you would have much more welcoming attitude towards foreign cultures, and it would be super easy, and the community would benefit. You would benefit personally, because it's just such a fulfilling or such a well, it's such a good feeling, isn't it, to be able to actually welcome someone, to make someone feel at home instead of trying to say, "Oh, you don't speak English? Well, okay, sorry, we speak English in Australia or in America. Go home and learn it." When in fact, you could spend 15 minutes and you would know how to say a few phrases in Spanish, which could really open up new relationships, new long-lasting
Absolutely.
bonds.
And what I often discover is that many of the people I say hello to have learned English, but just haven't had that really positive social encounter to use it productively. And generally, saying hello to them in their language can really ease that tension. And that's where, in fact, my most profound experiences um, with some of the community groups here have been in English. But after they had the confidence to really express,
It's just an
you know,
attitude, isn't it? It's not.
yeah,
It's not how much of the language you speak or don't speak. It's just the attitude that you say. I am welcoming towards your culture. I'm not trying to look at you as some kind of leech on our society that who are just here to take our natural resources. I'm actually seeing you for the person you are with a valuable history and cultural heritage, and I
and
want to
also
get to know you.
that I'd love to share in it. And I think again that's something that we've often constrained ourselves when it comes to thinking about our own identity. We have these fleeting experiences where we think, "Oh, I feel really drawn to that aspect of Asian philosophy, but I mean, how could I ever embrace it? I'm not Asian, therefore." So I think it's very important to just explore that as best you can at that moment, because you'll lose that opportunity and you'll put up that barrier that prevents you from ever exploring it
Be
in the
open and
future.
welcoming. Be
Yeah,
open and welcoming. Yeah, especially now with Europe getting a lot of Syrian refugees. So I mean that would be a great opportunity to learn a little bit of Arabic and get to know exactly what's going on. How what is because when you see Syria on the TV, it's like it's a war zone and it's a
absolutely.
dictatorship and it sounds like a terrible disaster. So if you could actually go and speak to people from there, that what kind of amazing view of the world or indeed Syria could you get from that kind of encounter, and how much better could you make their lives because they feel like they're completely isolated from the rest of the non Arabic speaking Europe. So
Absolutely.
there
And
you
in
go.
many ways, I mean, I was very, it's hard to discuss such topics, but I was very much uh, I was very much apologies. I I just take a moment. I
Sorry.
couldn't help but I couldn't help but feel like there was a sense of purpose in the ways I came to learn the Arabic language when I obviously heard for myself in my own community we're taking on 500, very small number of Syrian refugees, but I thought perhaps in some way I'm now better prepared to ease the transition of just a few of those families and the like. And certainly I don't want to feel like, it's due to their suffering that I now have that opportunity, but I certainly do see it as an opportunity. And I know that many Tasmanians are welcoming those 500 arrivals, and we're very much implementing ways that we can make that transition process easy for them, and hopefully see opportunities for their children to grow up in a scenario just like my own, where there is very little limitation on their lives now here in Australia.
Yeah, and hopefully learning learning Arabic as well as English as they grow up,
Absolutely.
or
And
all
yeah,
the languages.
again really shifting that focus away from from the assimilation aspects that went with the previous
Yeah.
generations.
Yeah, it's quite unfortunate that happened, but you see the same pattern in America, in England as well. I suppose it's just you just see that people have this assumption that if, and I maybe rightly so, that if you wanted to do something in that country, English was your target language. I mean, you had to have English to have a good career, and so I guess a lot of the parents back then just, I guess they just started sort of they went too far a little bit on the integration, and they just switched to
Mm.
English in an attempt to, I guess, fit in better. But if we had been more approaching, if we had been more welcoming, I'm saying we as a sort of 1930s, 1950s world, if we had been more welcoming to foreign cultures and languages to begin with, we would have just had lots of languages all over the place, and it would be a symbiotic relationship instead of this either or.
And I
And
think importantly, you wouldn't have so many people out there now of our own generation trying desperately to realize or to define their own identities.
yeah, learn the language of their grandfather or whatever. It's there's I hear that all the time. People are saying, "Oh yeah, my family came from Poland," or Denmark. Even sometimes I hear, and
Mm,
I'm like, "So do you know any language?" Not really. And
mm.
it's just
Well,
sad in a way.
the saddest thing is that in my own scenario, working as a teaching English as a second another language tutor, I'm encountering scenarios where children are favoring English over their home language, and they're obviously learning at such a phenomenal rate, being socialized through school
Yeah.
and the like, that they're actually losing the opportunity to speak with their immediate parents here. So yeah, it is a very sad scenario, and I think the first step is about changing attitudes towards the value of those languages within the community.
Yeah, welcome them instead of shun them, and just appreciate them, because obviously the parents are not doing it on purpose. They're just doing it because that's the nature of the community they came to some time ago, where it was just if you were speaking in Polish, then people were just like, oh, they're speaking foreign again, and
Yeah.
I guess it was a question of fitting in or some.
And in a more recent context, I mean, people are struggling in many ways to do exactly what we're doing. People coming to English speaking countries as adults are struggling with the limited resources to learn English whilst their children are receiving a thorough immersion
Oh
environment.
yeah,
Um,
that's
and the
true.
like.
That's true. There's a bit of a paradox going on there, where
Yeah.
the children are not learning the original language, and the parents or whatever want to learn the English as well. So I don't quite understand how that works, but it's definitely a bit of a split world in that sense.
It is, and it is very isolating, and I think it will lead to um, more difficulties for people to navigate that realm of identity realization.
Yeah, because it goes both ways, doesn't it? I just realized that when, for instance, if you have a large group in a community of a certain background, let's say Chinese or whatever, it's very actually isolating for that sub community in within the community. So they don't get the contact with the English speakers at all, and therefore they don't learn the English.
Yeah,
So that's probably the problem. Whereas if everyone was a lot more welcome and learn a few words of Chinese just to get the introduction, I'm sure you can figure it out as you go along. You don't have to learn Mandarin to C2 level to be able to go over to someone and say hi. Uh, and
absolutely.
if you do that, then you get those relationships as we've been talking about, and that means that the people from that sub community get exposure to the grander community, the bigger community, and therefore also absorb a lot more English. So it goes both ways, and I think if you have that kind of welcoming attitude, you're not going to have a dominant language necessarily. I think people are going to stick to their native language, but they're going to be so much better in their next language.
Yeah, it's all about confidence building, and that's why so much of my focus on building those relationships has been about reconstructing my idea of those imagined communities and the
Hmm.
imagined communities of those I'm attempting to engage with. And because that's all that really changed through my associations was the the constructed idea of what those communities represented and what I actually discovered through minimal efforts in the language.
Right. And that's another good point, perhaps a good one to wind down the episode on is in general language learning, you get a lot of mileage out of the first, 100 words, 500 words, the first 20 sentences. You can do a lot of work with that. Whereas if you know 15,000 words, the next 100 are not going to really do much for you. So that's a really good point.
Absolutely. And I will reiterate what Irina had to say in her interview, which was to use as much as you can, to use those dribs and drabs of the language, because it all creates um, that sense of shared community with whoever you're engaging with, and it creates that sense of bonding and laughter and the like when mistakes come about.
Yes, to at the expense of me usually, but that's okay. I'm definitely an expert in making comical mistakes. But luckily, most of the time, I'm the only one who knows it because the native speaker doesn't understand what I'm trying to say, and the people who don't speak the language don't know what I was going to say. So it's totally fine. But anyway, Marcus, it was a very deep at the end here, but I really enjoyed the conversation, and I hope that through the efforts of definitely the podcast and also your pursuits and the people listening that we can change the world and how cultures coexist. Because I think that the internet and the globalization has definitely pushed things in the right direction, but there are still there's still lots of work to be done. And I think if we could all embrace a much more welcoming attitude like your own, we can have a much better tomorrow.
Thank you so very much for your kind words, Chris. I think as long as those changes happen indirectly and informally, as long as people take away something from the episode and think about their own position without necessarily taking my own experiences as an utmost example, I thank you for your kind words on what I'm hoping to achieve here in my small community, and I thank you for welcoming me into your larger community through the podcast and the blog.
You're very welcome, and thank you for taking the time out of your day to chat with me.
No worries.
Thank you so much for listening to the Actual Fluency podcast. If you want to come onto the podcast and share your language learning story, don't hesitate to apply on actualfluency.com/guest. See you in the next one.